For our second week in a row of the Shining Revelry metagame in Pokemon Pocket, there is not a single deck that's standing out with a dominating performance among the others in our major tournament results. Let's go ahead and dive on into the meta report for what could quite possibly be one of the most balanced metagames Pokemon Pocket has had to date. Let's kick things off by looking at the starting metagame distribution from our largest Pokemon Pocket tournament this past weekend. We had 6 different decks that were 5% or more of the starting metagame. Darkrai Giratina being 15%, 17 Trainer Giratina Mewtwo being 13%, Gyarados EX Manaphy being 11%, and then Charizard, Meowscarada Beedrill, and Gallade Hitmonlee all being approximately 6% each. Moving on to some week over week starting metagame distribution comparisons, we have a number of things that aren't all that surprising. Darkrai Giratina and Gyarados Manaphy builds being similar to where they were last week makes a lot of sense considering they had positive performances but not by large margins during our last meta report. 17 Trainer Giratina skyrocketing up from single-digit percentages to the second most played deck also tracks considering it was the best performer last week by a wide margin in its small sample. Meowscarada decks not being at the top but getting on the pie chart I think tracks as well, since it's likely one of the more playable cards from our latest expansion that took folks a little bit longer to get fully figured out. I think the most surprising things about our week over week is both Charizard getting on the map despite not really gaining anything new, as well as Gallade shrinking a little bit when it had a fine performance last week. It's also worth calling out the number of archetypes that were on the chart last week that simply did not have play rates or performances to be worth considering in our starting distribution this time around. The previous metagames powerhouse Dialga Arceus falling flatter on its face this week than in the first week, its metagame percentage shrinking to under 4% and its performance doing even worse. Rampardos Lucario falling, as well as Darkrai Weavile as well, which is a little bit surprising considering both of those decks had all right performances in our first weekend's metagame. Next up, we'll measure the performance of these most popular archetypes by drawing comparisons between the representation in the starting metagame distribution and the almost 200 deck list that had over 60% win rates in our largest tournaments this weekend. Starting from the top, Darkrai Giratina represents 18% of our top performers, a 20% increase from its starting distribution. Gyarados Manaphy increases by 36% up to 15% of our top performers. 17 Trainer Giratina is not able to repeat its dominating performance in the first week, increasing only by 8% up to 14% of our top performing distribution. Our last 3 decks are pretty split in their performance overall. Meowscarada Beedrill gains 33% up to 8% of our top performers. Gallade Hitmonlee remains exactly flat, being 6% of the top performers with a 6% starting distribution. And Charizard Moltres is the worst performer of our most popular decks, shrinking from a 6% starting metagame share to only 4% of the most successful deck lists this week. I said at the beginning, this feels like one of the most balanced metagame Pokemon Pocket has ever had because looking at these performance metrics, there's no crazy standout. For comparison's sake, in our previous metagames where there was a particular deck standing out, heading into the second and third week of competition like these results are from, there would typically be a deck with a double-digit starting metagame percentage that was putting up 50, 75, or even 100+% performance deltas, increasing its metagame share between the starting and top performing deck lists by a very significant margin. I think it's especially noteworthy that the new deck to kind of break out onto the scene this week, that 17 Trainer Giratina, fell really flat in its performance from last week where it had doubled up, being just an 8% increase overall. Darkrai Giratina and Gyarados Manaphy both being decks that were known and having reasonable performances this week, but not by standout measures, I think means that while they're very clearly good decks, they are likely not head and shoulders above anything else in the metagame that's going on right now. Next, let's dive on into some deck list specifics and developments of these most common archetypes and talk about what their matchup tables look like to see if we can maybe predict where the format's going to head in the future. The biggest development in our most popular deck list this week, Darkrai Tina, is that a majority of people finding success with this deck are no longer playing any copies of Druddigon as a stalling lead, instead simply playing just 4 basics, 2 Giratina and 2 Darkrai, with the full 16 trainers as support. Comparing the matchup tables from last week to this week, this change's primary impact looks to be that it takes the matchup against the 17 trainer Giratina Mewtwo deck and moves it from unfavorable for the Darkrai variation to them being a little bit ahead. This would likely explain why that 17 trainer deck, while still having a strong performance this week, didn't overperform by remotely as much as it did during week 1, since the most popular deck in the metagame is largely adapting to have a better matchup there. Other places that change with the dropping of Druddigon is the Gyarados matchup, while not good for Darkrai Giratina, is less bad than it was last week, and the Charizard matchup that had previously been bad for Darkrai Giratina is actually slightly favored for it now, which could be the explainer for both why Charizard got more popular this week, but also had an underperformance overall, since the most popular deck made adaptations that were bad for Charizard's position overall. Another development with Darkrai Giratina is that around 10% of the deck lists registered in our tournaments weren't all in on the 16 trainer plan, instead still playing 6 basics, but featuring 2 copies of Arceus EX as the 5th and 6th. One of the primary upsides that these builds get to leverage is playing a copy or 2 of the Dawn supporter, which means when you have Arceus and Giratina on your bench to start, you can Dawn that psychic energy from Giratina up to Arceus to let you start attacking with it that much sooner, letting you take an incredibly aggressive position that I would wager makes you a lot better into matchups like a Gyarados that normally run you down while you're dirtling around getting set up. Moving along to 17 trainer Giratina Mewtwo, we see no really noteworthy developments in the card composition for these decks this week. The 2 ofs you see common across most of the decks are Giant Cape, Potion, and Red, while all the various 1-of utility cards see a lot of variation. Looking at the matchup tables for this archetype into the other popular things, it's got a pretty even spread with nothing being too polarizingly favorable or against it. You're about dead even against Gyarados Manaphy, you're slightly ahead against Gallade Hitmonlee and Charizard Moltres, and you're a touch behind against Meowscarada and Giratina Darkrai. Gyarados Manaphy actually ends up having one of the most even set of matchup tables we've ever seen for a Gyarados deck since this card was added to the metagame. It's almost dead even against Giratina Darkrai, Giratina Mewtwo, and Charizard. It absolutely is trouncing the Meowscarada Beedrill variations, and it's coming up incredibly short against decks featuring Hitmonlee like Gallade, as you would expect. Meowscarada variations, the most popular of which this weekend was featuring the 1/1/1 evolution stage of Beedrill as its secondary attacker, are probably the archetype that has benefited the most from the removal of Druddigon for most of the popular Giratina Darkrai decks. This deck list is absolutely feasting on the most popular deck in the metagame, winning that matchup upwards of 70% of the time. That being said, dunking on number 1 does not come without its cost, as this Meowscarada Beedrill deck only won against Gyarados Manaphy around 20%. Its matchups into other popular decks like Giratina Mewtwo and Charizard are relatively even, while this deck list does struggle against Gallade Hitmonlee, likely due to the fact that that deck has a variety of non-EX Pokemon that they can often lead on. While it had a much lower play rate than the Meowscarada Beedrill build, I'd also like to call out the Meowscarada Wigglytuff deck that we showcased in the new decks roundup yesterday. If you missed everything else in that video, I'll link it in the video description down below. This build has very similar matchup tables against the popular decks that the Meowscarada Beedrill deck does, with the asterisk that this build featuring Wigglytuff actually won the mirror every single time against the build featuring Beedrill. It was in a smaller sample size, but I think it also makes sense from a theory perspective that not having an EX Pokemon in your deck makes you better against an opposing Meowscarada, and the sustain from Wigglytuff in tandem with Erica probably lets you win the Meowscarada on Meowscarada fights a good frequent amount of the time. Gallade's relatively neutral performance this week makes complete sense when we take a look at its matchups against the three most popular decks in the metagame. It's dead even against Darkrai Tina. It absolutely dominates the Gyarados matchup, but it's also pretty far behind against the Tina Mewtwo Psychic 17 trainer variations. To close out with a few comments on Charizard, it's completely unsurprising that they've moved to playing the new Charmander and Charmeleon, as these allow you to go 1 energy attack, 2 energy attack, 3 energy attack on Charizard while you build up organically into that Crimson Storm in the games where you don't have a Moltres around. This makes it a little bit less critical that you lead on the bird acceleration in your games, giving you a little bit more flexible game plan. All of that being said, I also wouldn't be surprised if Charizard's metagame share drops off heading into the next week, because looking at its matchups against the popular decks, it's not favored against any of them, and it's even a little bit behind in its best matchup against these three, which is the Gyarados deck. Looking at the performance metrics of everything among these most popular decks, I honestly don't expect to see any big movement moving into our next weekend of the metagame developing, unless something new is discovered that can keep up with all three decks at the top. Anecdotally, in my experience climbing the ladder practically to Ultra 4 at this point, this format seems pretty balanced. While there's very clear meta decks that have high metagame percentages, like the ones we showcased in the video today that you can expect to play into, I've been finding success with them with a variety of things, and I don't feel like I can't brew in this metagame, which is all I personally really want out of a fun TCG format. If you missed it yesterday and you're looking for more off-meta things that can be successful, be sure to check out my new decks roundup linked in the video description down below, where I combed through all of the tournament deck lists for the less common decks that spiked results that could be the next breakout thing. If you enjoyed today's data-driven meta report roundup, please smash the like button on this video to help it reach some more people. And if you happen to be new here, consider subscribing to the channel. I post deck highlights of off-meta things like in the other video that I was just talking about. I do data-driven reports like this weekly. I'd love to see you come back again sometime. I appreciate everybody that made it all the way through to the end of the video, and I hope your next pack is an excellent one.